Welcome everyone to our Digital Contracting for Net Zero series, where we explore with leaders in the field how legal teams are jumping into action to support corporate climate ambition. Today, we're joined by Marko Misko to explore how lawyers are aligning construction supply chains with net zero and the growing importance of technology as an enabler in this space. Marko is a front-end infrastructure lawyer and partner with HWL Ebsworth Lawyers. He advises on project structures and delivery models, procurement, risk allocation, contract drafting and negotiation, and project management. So a diverse skill set here, Marko, fantastic. Marko works across the whole spectrum of infrastructure sectors, including transport, defence, foreign aid, health, education, energy and utilities, housing, and commercial and industrial developments. Marko has a passion for the environment and sustainability, hence he's here. We're really excited to hear what you have to say, Marko, and is chair of the Sustainability Policy Chapter at Rhodes Australia, and also a board member, and Honorary General Counsel of the Infrastructure Sustainability Council of Australia, having also served as board member. Fabulous credentials, Marko. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It's great to have you here. Really looking forward to this conversation around net zero and construction space and construction supply chains. Can we start off by asking you the question, what are you seeing around the grounds? Like, what's happening in construction supply chains in response to net zero, in particular COP26 last year?
Okay, well, I'll actually start from less of a legal perspective, but more from my perspective as the chapter chair of sustainability at Rhodes Australia. In June, we released the Journey to Net Zero, which was far more than just a glossy coffee table book. I think there has been a lot of aspirational discussion about sustainability, whole of life, net zero, etc. But the purpose of this was to actually create a formal sort of best practice guide to what a number of projects around the world are doing, and then provide a series of recommendations. So I think we've roughly got about 30 recommendations in that. We commissioned KPMG, so there's a plug for KPMG, to produce the report, and then we formally issued it to industry back in June in Sydney at a function involving a couple of hundred people. So I think we're starting to see that people aren't just aspirational, but actually want recommendations and then detailed action plans. And that, from a Rhodes Australia perspective, that's our next step. What we're going to do is say, well, the journey doesn't finish with producing that fantastic report. That's the start of the journey. Now it's a matter of looking at each of the recommendations and what's the action plan for engaging with industry, guiding industry as how to achieve those particular recommendations. So that's one example, but I think it shows that there really is a far more significant push now with industry. Industry understands how important it is at that macro level. It then, of course, is a matter of how each particular player in the industry decides to pursue it, and then how on each particular project it's implemented. And hopefully we'll get to talk about at the project level, procurement, the contract, etc., etc.
Fantastic. Are there any particular take-homes from the recommendations made that really resonate with you as a lawyer?
Not any one particular over the other. It's more that there are detailed recommendations, and that there will be plans of action for how to implement each of those. And as I say, it's only in the last week that we've had a policy meeting with Rhodes Australia discussing the next steps for that.
Fantastic. Can I ask, Marko, I mean, you've been working in the space for a long time, and you're a real passionate advocate for, I can see, I'm talking in our preparation for this interview series, you have a long history of wanting to stand up for the environment. What does this mean for you as a lawyer now, like in a nutshell?
Well, it's funny you say that, because I read a fantastic article in the Fin Review not too long ago, and it was either a judge or retired judge who said that lawyers actually have a duty when it comes to climate change, when it comes to net zero, when it comes to sustainability. And of course, all sorts of different lawyers will have different duties in that respect. From my perspective, as a front-end project infrastructure lawyer, I think the duty is to at least flag the issue as to sustainability and net zero these days on every single project that you get involved in, because as we know, and the statistics are quite phenomenal about how much worldwide the construction industry contributes to carbon and other environmental and sustainability issues. So I think a front-end infrastructure lawyer has a duty to ensure that at the outset, this issue is being flagged, it's front of mind with the relevant clients, and that then you're providing options and potential solutions for how the particular objectives can be achieved. So that it's not just a matter of saying, okay, well, at the start of a project, we want to structure it in a particular way. Here's an issues list with all of the usual, if you like, traditional risks.
Yes. Yes.
Climate change is a key risk. And I think as a front-end infrastructure lawyer, you owe a duty to ensure that on any issues list of your top 10 risks, top 10 issues on a project, that is one of them. And then you're coming armed with potential options for how to address it to the extent required.
Can you go into a little bit more detail around how that works? So, okay, climate, something needs to be, top 10 issue that needs to be thought through, aligning it with the net zero ambitions of your client. Can you talk us through what those conversations look like, and what tools does a lawyer need to be effective in this space?
Great question, thank you. I could talk about this till the cows come home, which is a sustainability issue in itself. But anyway, what I was going to say was, I think, so in that front end, if you're working with a particular client and an agency on putting together a project, the issues you've got are, what's the delivery model you're going to use? What procurement process are you going to use? What are then going to be the detailed contractual provisions that deal with these sorts of issues? Let's just break it down into those three, because for me, the starting point has to be, okay, let's go through the project risks and issues. We've identified sustainability, we've identified climate change, net zero as a key risk. You have to start by getting the client to say, this is what my objective is in this space. What am I trying to achieve? And then that will colour how much or how little you do in your choice of delivery model, in your choice of procurement process, and then ultimately the detailed contract conditions. Just on the delivery model, really quickly, and I think this should be the case for many, many reasons, but my preference is to choose a collaborative delivery model, which involves in earlier industry involvement, early industry engagement in the entire process, so that you as a client, as an agency delivering a major project, don't take the project detail, the design, the scope, etc., to a particular point where by the time you're going out to industry, it's quite prescriptive. So you lose the ability to innovate, you lose flexibility. With an early contract delivery model, you've got a greater chance of driving sustainability outcomes, climate change, and net zero outcomes, because you've got industry involved in an earlier stage before the project has been, if you like, fully specified, and usually before you've actually got, say, classic hard dollar lump sum bids from industry, whether it's for design, construction, operation, or maintenance. So you're working with industry in a collaborative way earlier on. So that's the first point, the delivery model.
Yes.
Nothing wrong with your classic traditional hard dollar delivery models, but you're not going to drive sustainability and net zero initiatives through that. The second one is the procurement process. There's no point in running a procurement process where you don't really focus on getting submissions back, proposals back on sustainability, climate change, net zero, but then saying, well, once we enter into the contract, magically we're going to impose all of these, strict contractual obligations, and somehow that will compel you to achieve these outcomes. You've got to have a procurement process where you're key messaging these issues to industry and then saying you need to bid back to us exactly the optimal response and what it is that you can do in these particular spaces. But of course, having regard to what our other project objectives are. So, potentially getting back draft sustainability plans, getting back proposals as to alternative materials or alternative construction methodology that might assist in driving these particular forms of outcome. And that enables a couple of things, I think. Firstly, you can ensure that you then pick the best tenderer in that particular respect. but then also you've got drafts of plans and other things that you can then use to actually have contractual significance once you get into, the planning, the scoping, and the design and construction of the relevant project. The third thing then, of course, is the actual detailed contract and what it is that you'll try to achieve. Because with a number of these things, it's not black and white as it might be with, say, a budget outcome or a program outcome, where you might have a strict obligation to deliver a project for a particular price or to deliver it by a particular completion date. A number of these things are aspirational, so you're not typically imposing strict contractual obligations. They're often best endeavours obligations. Let's do our best to achieve a particular set of outcomes as to sustainability, net zero, etc. But then the thing is, well, what are the consequences? And this is where things like KPIs and incentives come in, where you might say, well, let's list KPIs dealing with sustainability and related issues. Then let's monitor how we actually achieve against those. And we might have bonuses or some other form of incentive against achievement of those KPIs.
Yeah, no, it's so important. It's so important to sense the counterparties in these contract negotiations and understand sort of where they're at in their life cycle for net zero. There's a huge amount of variation. I think everyone, their ambition and then the implementation and where organisations are in that implementation and how they're incorporating contractual clauses dealing with climate. So yeah, light on to heavy touch. Can I take you back, Marco, to RFPs? I mean, lawyers are often involved in reviewing RFP, responses for their clients. How is this working in practice? Are organisations asking tenderers to provide two different quotes, two different approaches, one that's very green, one that's less green? How is this working in practice, please?
Very, very good question. And one of the things I've been thinking about in this space, and we're starting to do it in other spaces like safety, for instance, where you say, safety is an absolute not negotiable, but what we don't want is to have tenderers on the one hand wanting to provide the best safety outcome, but then potentially concerned about value for money and ensuring that they provide the best value for money bid. So one of the things you can do is quarantine the bid to the extent it deals with issues like, say, sustainability, etc., and say, give us your bid, price that bid for us on whatever basis it is, but then separately tell us what the sustainability solutions are going to cost, and maybe we won't take that into account in the same way when we're looking at your pricing for the purposes of value for money. So we'll quarantine it and say, we're not going to evaluate price on that because it's more important to us. We'd rather get the best sustainability outcome, and we don't want you to feel constrained in a competitive bidding process and sort of saying, well, we could give this, but let's not offer it because it's too expensive. We'll price ourselves out of the market. So I'm starting to see that with a number of those, for want of a better word, for a number of those policy type objectives, whether it be safety, whether it be, say, Indigenous inclusion, whether it be sustainability, that you can say, well, let's quarantine it and evaluate it differently.
Yeah, makes sense. RFP done, we have a successful tenderer, we're in contract negotiations now. Tips and traps for new players negotiating climate-related provisions.
Well, negotiating, this is interesting because it's not just the contract negotiation, but it's then once you're into contract and you start getting into the, if you like, design, development, risk reduction studies, etc., etc. So the negotiation's ongoing, and this is the issue because there's a trade-off, and I think the use of alternative materials, particularly in roads, is a great example of that, where you have this trade-off, and to some extent there's a negotiation. And again, this is where partly lawyers, but not just lawyers, all the project professionals come into play, in that on the one hand, you might say using a particular alternative material is going to provide the best sustainability outcome, but then you might have an engineer, another design consultant, and their lawyers saying, yes, but the concern is if we use that, we may not necessarily achieve the required functionality, operability, maintainability, whole of life outcome. So what do you want? Do you want sustainability, or do you want to get the best fitness for purpose outcome? Because these traditional materials, let's say, will guarantee that particular outcome. It's perhaps less certain when it comes to the use of these alternative materials. So the first point, of course, is, well, how mission critical is fitness for purpose? Particularly if it's a road, if it's an airbase, etc., where you say, well, it is, that's pretty critical. One of the things I think lawyers have to be able to do in that space is to say, well, in certain circumstances, maybe it is that even though fitness for purpose is important, if we're really trying to shoot for sustainability, we can actually play around with the liability regime and perhaps say that, if a client is happy to achieve a particular sustainability outcome using alternative materials, alternative work methodology, then maybe we carve that out from fitness for purpose or deal with it in another way. So I think that's what lawyers have to be creative.
Fantastic. That's really interesting. So it's sort of that risk allocation and bending and flexing for sustainable options at the end of the day. Can you give me an example? I think you shared an example with me during our briefing for this webinar around tarmacs. It's really good to have a story to tell here.
Well, I'll give you two, not one, but two.
Fantastic.
There you go. I'll give you one about materials and then one about work method. So the first one with materials, yes, we're working on a program of works redoing all of Defence's air bases around the country, which involves ripping up, obviously, a lot of the old asphalt. But then it's a matter of saying, well, what do you do with that? Can you reuse it, or do you just dump it off site, etc., etc.? It is possible to actually reuse it within certain parameters. Earlier on in the program of works, we did have design consultants quite resistant to that, because their concern was, well, look, if you direct me to do that, I do that, and then we don't achieve fitness for purpose, you're going to come straight back to me. Because it's a program of works over a number of years, we've been able to refine that approach. These projects are also being delivered, going back to the delivery model issue, on an early contractor involvement basis, which means you are getting the contractor involved earlier to work with the design team to come up with solutions. So rather than mandating that you have to reuse all of that asphalt, we're putting in place structures through early contractor involvement to at least consider it, and then the team as a whole, as an integrated project team, coming up with optimal solutions.
That's a beautiful example of collaboration, right? At play.
And again, it goes back to,
yes,
to maximise the sustainability outcomes, you need the collaboration. The other one, which was interesting a number of years ago, which was a big government project here in Coburg, the Nicholson. And so this is going back to construction method and the extent to which changes in construction method can also address sustainability outcomes. So the Nicholson was built as a modular development, where essentially the building, the apartment building, was built in a factory, so fabricated and then shipped out to site. So again, what does that do? That significantly decreases the time on site. It significantly decreases the construction cycle, and therefore has all of the benefits that flow from that. But also, you're manufacturing rather than constructing on site. With manufacture, you can significantly reduce the extent of waste. So again, another great sustainability outcome. But with that come issues. I'm not going to go into all of the detail, but when something's being built in a factory rather than on site, the key issue for an owner is, well, if I'm paying you for that, let's say on a monthly basis, the way you usually do in construction, when you're affixing that to my site, it becomes part of my site. So as a matter of property law, I own that. So I'm satisfied that if something goes wrong, worst case scenario, and you default, then I own everything I've paid for. But if you're paying for something that's sitting in a factory, that contractor defaults, it's all very well to rock up and say, look, I've paid for that. But you'll be met with a liquidator who says, well, that's absolutely fine, but unfortunately you don't own it. It hasn't been affixed to your site, so it's not part of your site, et cetera, et cetera. So when we did that project, we had to create a totally different payment, risk, title and security regime to ensure that if the government paid for this, it was close to fully constructed, let's just say, to use an example, sitting in a factory that big government had all the rights necessary to enforce its title to those particular assets that it had paid for. So again, you've got to want to achieve these particular outcomes, but then you've got to be creative and say, well, legally, this is how we can do it, rather than saying, oh no, that sounds too risky, I don't think you should do that. It should be, sounds great, and let's work out a way that we can achieve what you need.
I'm so glad that you're at the negotiation table working out these creative mechanisms to make sure it works at the end of the day and delivering outcome. Can we shift a gear a bit in relation and focus more on sort of technology and as an enabler in data? So you touched on KPIs, right? And negotiating KPIs in contracts. Could you talk to us a bit about what you're seeing in the market by way of KPIs and any insights around current use of technology and data? What's going to happen next in this space?
Okay, well, if I could actually, let's focus on the technology point, because I think there's some really interesting issues at play there. Firstly, a number of years ago, BIM, building information modelling or building information management, depending on, I suppose, which side of the tracks you come from, exploded on the Australian scene. It had actually been used by a number of people for a long period of time, but suddenly a number of contractors and consultants, but also a number of recidivist owners / principals, in other words, agencies that are delivery agencies that deliver a lot of infrastructure, particularly at the public sector level, sort of thought, well, okay, it seems like that there are a lot of benefits that can come from building information modelling. Why don't we start using it? I, in fact, worked on a 5-year project with Defence to work out how Defence, which does 3 billion worth of infrastructure, roughly, let's say, each and every year around the country, and therefore it could get real benefits from this, how it could use BIM to drive a number of outcomes in its projects, including things like ensuring that you minimise waste, because of course with BIM you're designing twice, or designing, you're building twice, because you design everything using technology. So you're minimising waste, you're minimising coordination issues, et cetera, so that construction becomes sort of, is intended to become a far easier, less risky process. So we considered that over a number of years. We developed a suite of integrated project delivery contracts, which were designed to maximise the uptake of BIM, and we implemented across a series of pilots. I do have to say that the outcomes were actually quite disappointing, and that industry, although it promised a lot, didn't quite deliver to the extent that Defence was expecting through those particular pilots. There has needed to be, I think, greater leadership at that BIM level around Australia. I did sit on a board which was called ABAB, the Australasian BIM Advisory Board, and I think it's made a lot of headway in that space to try to bring everything together so that you have a more consistent approach to the implementation of BIM. But I still think there's a lot to be done in that space. When you look at case studies using BIM and other forms of digital engineering, those case studies tend to show that there are absolutely manifest benefits that can be achieved in the design, reducing waste, reducing coordination and other issues in the design, optimizing the design, so you're using the right materials, so resulting in cost reductions, program reductions, and then other benefits as well. And that's, of course, just focusing on the D&C, the design and construct side. Then there, of course, there are all the operations and maintenance outcomes that you get through using digital engineering as well. Not to mention just one other thing, which is, of course, using this during, quite apart from the D&C phase, once you get into the operating life cycle of an asset, digital engineering, and that ensures that you get the optimal level of information about the performance of the assets, the infrastructure, the buildings that you've created, their ongoing condition, so that you can be making better decisions about how to operate them, how to maintain them, what the optimal approach to maintenance should be, and then other issues like, whether it's midlife upgrades, et cetera, to ensure you're getting most out of the performance and condition of those assets. And as you said, that of course that then can all feed back into KPIs, whether it's for the designers and constructors or the operators and maintainers of the assets.
Marco, is there a question that you'd like me to ask that we haven't asked yet? I always like asking that question because there might be some burning issue you'd like to share with our audience. Is there anything that you'd like to share based on your experience to inspire our new lawyers working in this space, junior, seasoned lawyers, to make a difference in relation to climate?
Well, it's interesting. I am a unabashed, massive Midnight Oil fan. And so, of course, I'm sort of in mourning at the moment now that they've finished officially touring, but I did get to see them in September in St Kilda. It was, you mentioned COP26. The thing I loved, and it is quite inspirational, that they released Rising Seas, a magnificent song, a magnificent film clip at exactly the time that COP26 was happening. So, but that's my, that's part of my personal inspiration. As I said at the outset, I think every front end lawyer now has a duty to address these things. But it's not this is not a nice to have. This we know that it's absolutely critical. Yeah, and the time is now. Yeah. And the 2050 is actually too late. 2050 is too late.
Absolutely.
That's the driver. It's far too late. So things have to be happening now and in our space. If you talk about sort of the passion, the inspiration, as I said at the outset, the construction industry traditionally is such a significant contributor to carbon worldwide that things need to happen and can happen significantly if we address that issue in our space.
Yeah. Look, at the end of the day, it's a purpose of saving our planet, saving humanity. That's an inspiration in itself. It's really interesting to see the pressure not only from investors but customers and employees within organisations to do the right thing for climate change. So this has been a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed this, chatting about this very important topic with you, Marco. As Marshall McLuhan put it, there are no passengers on Spaceship Earth. We are all crew. So it's incumbent on us to roll up our sleeves and put the dial up on climate, one contract at a time, one deal at a time, from early stages through to RFP, through to ongoing contract maintenance and everything that needs to be managed within contract to make sure we're on track. And yes, 2050 is too late. Let's try to bring it forward. Thank you, Marco, for your leadership. I'm Natalia Srnemarkovic, Distinguished Fellow with the Centre for Legal Innovation. Have a good day.